appreciate that. And I'm sure you might have all, Googled Eben and know about his background. And he's a professor of law at Columbia and the chairman of the Software Freedom Law Center. But what you probably don't know is that Eben used to work for IBM in the 70s and 80s, I believe. He worked at Research. He was both a systems programmer and an attorney. I don't want to say much more because that's
already quite a good attorney.
Yes, because that's pretty much the past, and Eben is really here to talk about the future and a lot about the future of software. So, Eben.
All right. Well, since I'm not going to use it, we'll trust that the one I am using is in being as short as I am. I have to be sure I clear the penguins, Dave. So, thank you. It's an honor to be here. The last moment of my career as a technical worker at IBM would have been driving out of the parking lot at Yorktown almost exactly 25 years ago. And I'm both a little astonished at the passage of time and a little humbled to be back. I was, I suppose, minimally qualified to hold up my end among technical people 25 years ago at that moment, driving out of the Yorktown parking lot on my way back to law school in New Haven. I have, of course, ceased to be technically competent since then, largely because all the paradigms have shifted and all the stuff which, as a developer of APL interpreters, I hoped we were going to do with software hasn't happened. And all the things I was hoping I was never going to see again, like a zero-pointer loaded and branched on, has become the industry at its best. I want to talk a little bit then about software as we all understand it, and a little bit about software as we don't understand it. That is to say, I want to ask a little bit about what happened or didn't happen to software in the last quarter century, and whether copyleft capitalism might be the answer to some of our unserved needs. I want to talk about the GPL, and I want to talk about the new GPL, GPLv3. I want to talk about them as technology rather than as law or politics, though the nature of my work is always to explain to students and young lawyers how you can't really separate technology, law, and politics where we work. So I'm going to try and approach that crystallized lump of technology, law, and politics, which is the current global software industry, through some technological ideas, some ideas about the ways in which organization affects the making of software. And I'm going to try then to draw lines of extrapolation outward from where we are now towards what I hope is the future, which I think is what we hoped for in the past and didn't get, if you follow my meaning. It comes then really to this. When I went to work at the Santa Teresa Laboratory in the summer of 1979, a few days after the 4th of July, 1979, I was given a bunch of bump for the laboratory, which I found a very impressive place to work, and I was particularly impressed as I walked through the corridors underneath the laboratory at the glass windows looking out on all the hectares of 3330s and 3350 disk drives that were out there, and all those people lifting platters at the end of a strong arm. And the spec sheet I was given when I joined the laboratory pointed out that 330 professional mainframe programmers making IMS and other serious industrial weight stuff, including all the language products, among whom I was now a toiler in the vineyard, all of us were working 2, sometimes 3 shifts on an enormous collection of 20 370-168s or better, equipped with all that DAS out there, all those strings and strings of drives, amounting in the end to the exorbitant figure 29 gigabytes. 29 gigabytes, as we are all accustomed now to thinking of it, is 9.8 millimeters high. It is 3.5 inches wide at maximum, and it costs, if you're really, really overpaying, $65 or $70 out there in the market. Hardware engineers achieved, in other words, miracles, right? Miracles of success in compression, in elegance, in function, and in the economics of beating the limitations in their corner. Software is arguably a little better than it was if you're really using good software. But if you're using what most people in the world use every day, all the time, to do all the things that have become the staples of their interaction with software in their lives, it is no question worse. The VM system that I used every day and for which I kept paper listings in my office, VMSP, was a nice operating system because you didn't need fiche to read the source. You could just flip the pieces of paper and study what it was that was going on if you didn't understand. I worked with Michel Hack of IBM Research on the VMCMS debugger called Pry. I did not. 25 years has probably changed both of us too much. Our ability to understand what was going on inside an operating system, providing multiple virtual machines operating to provide insulated servers that provided significant capacity to avoid the difficulties of blue screen of death on machines where blue screen of death would really have ruined your whole day. It was at least as good as anybody's current best attempts at making the same kind of software reliable in data center use. In other words, some fundamental limitations have been experienced with respect to software. Surely those limitations do not lie in the quality of the engineers. It is not the case that the hardware engineers were in any way brighter than the software engineers. It doesn't lie in the conscientiousness or depth of commitment to the activity. It doesn't even lie in the degree of sophistication of the educational system. Every CS graduate student I meet is way smarter as a programmer than I was at my very best. The problem is that we haven't allowed software to get better. We haven't allowed software to get better because there were extraordinary social and economic forces pressing against the improvement of software. They had largely to do with structures of prohibiting sharing. They had largely to do with institutions that increased friction, substantially enhanced the bottlenecking that is inevitable in technology, which is not subject to there's only one way to do it, second law of thermodynamics kind of limits, but instead is subject to limits that are set by history, by path dependency, by the arbitrariness of interactions, and by the terrible problems of interoperation with code you didn't write and don't control. The fundamental limitations that we experienced that prevented us from improving the quality of software by 9 orders of magnitude while our friends down the hall were improving the hardware by 9 orders of magnitude, the fundamental difficulties weren't in our heads, and they weren't with the programmability of computers, and they didn't lie in the inability of machines to think like us or us to think like machines, and they weren't the result of the fact that 10 times 0.1 isn't exactly 1. We had all kinds of solutions to all of those problems. The difficulties that beset us in the attempt to improve software with the same explosive elegance that hardware was improved lay, shall we say, in Redmond. But by pointing at them, we'd really only, in truth, be pointing at the problem in its most, sort of inflammatory, when-like form. It's not the agent of the difficulty. It's merely an aggravated example of the syndrome. To be sure, the fact that a company came to dominate the global software industry that didn't make any hardware, and if you don't count lumpy keyboards and some mice anyway, that didn't make anything until it started making tabletop supercomputers to lose money on, right? That wasn't really engaged in trying to figure out how to differentiate a hardware product that could be made and sold profitably. That's the real point. The rise to supremacy in the global software industry of a company that didn't have another high-value product to differentiate by showing good software was a serious problem. One can see in, the infinite loop What would have happened had the dominant software company in the world, playing by Microsoft rules, been doing so in order to differentiate high-value software products? And Apple has improved software some, but not very much. Again, there is no 9 orders of magnitude increase in the value of what we get from software as a consequence of Apple's need to differentiate expensive hardware. But there is proof that using software as a product differentiator for expensive hardware continues to function to force quality up. Yes? Well, right. I think those 2 points are both shrewd. Let's take them both. It is right to say, I think, that asking why hardware improved so much is very worth doing. One answer to which is that reverse engineering is really possible. That there really was a lot of difficulty maintaining more than short time to market advantage in hardware innovation. You could do that, but it was difficult to do anything more than that. Of course, people tried, and they succeeded to the extent that the patent system gave them an opportunity to enshrine time-to-market advantage into a longer statutory monopoly. But in the world of hardware, patent disclosures are meaningful, which is why people tend to use them very strategically. Because if your patent disclosures are publicly available early enough, people will actually know how to do what you are doing, and they will invent around, or at least they will gain on the piggybacking on the top of your research. Moreover, the electrical engineering world that the hardware engineers represented had been patented since the beginning. So the patent system did not function in a pathological way with them as it did in software. And I'll come back to that point because I think it's a crucial differentiator. The patent system remained valuable as a structure legally, an infrastructure for innovation in the world of hardware, and it did not remain, never was, couldn't be, for certain inbuilt reasons, a useful organizer of innovation in relation to software.
This manufacturer buying from one or another from two of them for various different clients. There was another manufacturer for electrical engines or for the head. So in the end, thinking that wasn't difficult was thinking based on bricks from the same device. Or if you think of
well, no, but there were vertically integrated manufacturers, of which IBM would be the primary example, right? From thin film head research all the way to the 3380 was an IBM product. And the first legal job I did for Cravath as a lawyer working in IBM's interest was to participate in the Cybernex litigation, which was all about what happened when an IBM manufacturing engineering team walked out from senior people on down and set up around the corner to be an independent supplier of IBM technology. The vertically integrated innovator was a very important part of the story, too. Yes, step by step, they kind of disappeared, including IBM sold the business to the very people whom you may recall had been trying to steal the business at the beginning. When I went to work at Cravath in 1984, IBM was hotly pursuing Hitachi. As you may recall, 2 senior Hitachi executives had been arrested at San Francisco International Airport, one of them carrying a reel of magnetic tape with IBM hard drive designs on it. And the resulting litigation and settlement with Hitachi was heavy lifting. Almost exactly 20 years to the day. I'm sorry? No, it was Hitachi. This was a separate event. Almost 20 years to the day after that event, the IBM sold the disk drive business to Hitachi. Lock, stock, and barrel. And I called a guy I had worked with in that generation who still works in this company, and I said, how things change. And he said, if somebody has been trying to burgle your house every night for 20 years solid, there comes a time when you just sell them the house. The spurs and springs and wheels and shock absorbers of innovation are complex all the time everywhere. And I know that I don't have a simple schematic for explaining either how it gets done or how to do it, which is, of course, the one for which heavy money would really be payable. But I can detect in the inability to share information and in the ability to lock up information so that it is too expensive and too dangerous to get to by reverse engineering mechanisms, a major part of what went wrong with software. When I look back on how I treated the IBM software product that I had day-to-day responsibility for improving in the late 70s and early 80s, the VSAPL interpreter, 400,000 lines of 370 assembler code, I realized that there is almost nothing that I did in the course of my job which would in any way have conflicted with the VSAPL interpreters being a GPL program.
Is that APL?
Yeah.
Do you know Eben Moglen?
Yes, I worked for Aiden. That's how I got to be driving out of the parking lot.
I was at Research when I joined 20 years ago. Great guy.
Aiden was my boss. That much I can say. All other matters should be left to be said by others. What I would point to about the way we treated that code was that the source was out there. Every 8-par came with a patch. Every time I wanted to discuss with somebody why they were patching the way they were patching, because I had something else to worry about, there was another member of the user group who cared about what it was that was on my mind, and a real conversation between the company and its customers about whether a particular patch was a good idea could be carried on among the 6 people in the world who really cared.
So this was before what OCL was early 80s?
Sure, we're talking about just the straightforward business of what it felt like to be in a development shop. I was then working for GPD at Santa Teresa. We had actual customers, and SEs took 8 pars, and they came to my desk with patches attached because people knew the code.
I know one of the first meetings where IBM got involved in open source, Larry Lobster, the key paper, is a field engineer in the 60s in North Dakota. He would patch things in the field based on the source code.
People had access to the product developers, and they spoke to those developers in knowledgeable terms because they had real access to the product. The question of ownership didn't matter. Redistributability wasn't the issue. The only real way to get something out into the world that other people could use would be through an IBM tape. So the product developers became a clearinghouse for a community of people. Now, I was working in a programming language which was a community of people anyway, right? A dialect, a thing that people came to out of intellectual and aesthetic appreciation and stayed in because they liked it. So that modeled the community around programs better than, let us say, IMS would have done at the same time. But surely the recognition that the company was benefiting from user innovation was never far from our minds. It would never have occurred to us to put up a sign that said, no more patches from customers, and we're ripping the source code back out of your hands, and we don't want you to know how it's done by the magic. That would have resulted in harm to all parties. And everybody understood that perfectly well.
Did you go to share meetings in those days?
Sure. The community was... The community was valuable, right? Everybody could feel that there was value in that community. Everybody understood that there was a technical collaboration between customers and manufacturer. We are talking, it is true, about a company which had problems with regulators and others concerning whether it was using its power in the marketplace fairly. But those problems were thought of as being about concentration in real product markets. And it was not a part of anybody's view that IBM was hiding knowledge, refusing to permit interoperation, trying to prevent people from understanding how things worked in order to avoid competing with them, and the whole panoply of informational restriction problems that Microsoft was beat up by both the United States and European governments about over the last 10 years. That's exactly right. No, the differentiation, the product differentiation reason for that activity was why it happened the way it happened. And as I say, one of the great difficulties in improving the general quality of software was that Microsoft made no hardware, had no other product to differentiate, and had no asset but its own source code, thus requiring it to take what, from the point of view of the previously dominant party in the industry, would have been an irrational position. Over-restriction of access to knowledge about how programs worked as a consequence of an insufficiently diversified business, so that they could not effectively take account of user innovation. That's the economic model I want to argue. They were vertically integrated, but they were integrated on too narrow a base that compelled their incentives in the direction of closing down knowledge about software. It required them to spend a vast portion of their winnings proselytizing for the view that this way is how you do innovation. And they announced to the world that they had made a software industry in their image, on their platform, by enabling others to engage in making software in the same way. The consequence of which was that their picture of incentives, their role in the ecology, and their absence of available use for user innovation re-described the software industry as a place where users are disempowered. Now we come back to your point about enterprise software. You can disempower the users of personal computers who have never used a computer before, but you can't disempower General Motors and stay in business. You have to continue to afford General Motors what General Motors needs to have, which is some control over its own destiny. That was, after all, the major part of what happened as digital decision-making and digital information collection and digital information assessment became crucial to business managers around the world. All businesses, this one and the mom-and-pop grocery down the street, share one underlying nightmare, which is that they will lose control over their destiny to parties who equip or support them, to financial parties or to suppliers or to parties reorganizing the market, down to the thugs who might redirect foot traffic away from their store if they don't get a protection payment. The goal of maintaining control over your own destiny is the air that managers breathe. And strategists do everything they can to avoid the creation of situations in which the business risks control over its destiny. As businesses around the world became increasingly dependent upon their IT infrastructure for all their operations, as businesses realized that without their IT infrastructure they would be literally deaf, dumb, and blind, they began to realize that the fate that the software industry had imposed on them. User innovation is not important. User access to the inner workings of products is not important. Protection of source code by the manufacturer of software is worth quality defects or difficulty in repair and interoperation in order to secure. They realized that this began to threaten their destiny.
I think it's worth noting, as some executives and attorneys explain, that's a lot of the reason IBM was so aggressive on patents. It's just to get freedom of action in the marketplace.
If you listen to almost all of the deeply patented organizations, except those whose P&L won't allow them to state it, if you listen to any of the deeply patented organizations, they'll say, we know the patent system is just an absolute chaos at the moment, but we must continue to participate in it aggressively because we must continue to defend ourselves against others. It is certainly the IBM position. It is the Nokia position, right? In negotiating the patent provisions of GPLv3 with everybody over the last 18 months, I was basically listening all the time to 10 companies who say we only have patents in order to defend ourselves against other people, and 2 people who carefully shut up when the subject was raised. The recognition that it's a bad situation and I have to do what I can to maintain my own freedom of action is one underlying large-scale response to the growth of intellectual friction and the increase in inelasticities in the exchange of information about how to improve software. And what Microsoft did, by virtue of its need to explain its own success and protect its model, was to suggest that their model and all the foothills that grew up around Microsoft was the only way to achieve innovation. That was, in fact, if you really want to speak the truth about it in pure Anglo-Saxon, the big lie. What had fundamentally happened was that a way of making less innovation had been sold to everybody who didn't know any better as how software innovation occurs. Now, having said all of this, I have yet to say a single thing about freedom. And I can feel the clients I represent growing restive. When are you going to start talking about freedom, they say. And it's understandable, because this is another form of the same concern with the protection of autonomy and the elimination of threats to the control of one's own destiny. I think the fundamental insight that put me working for Richard Stallman beginning in 1993 was the recognition that what Stallman believed people wanted and what I knew from my own experience business was going to want when the weather changed about software were fundamentally the same thing. The rise of Microsoft and the restructuring of software as a subject that's magic, you buy the thing and you're not allowed to know, put businesses increasingly at risk of loss of control over destiny. As the Microsoft tax on hardware began to fasten in, and global margins in the wonderful new personal computer world began to get thin as a rail. Even IT industry parties began to realize that their autonomy was threatened. Then we can add certain techniques of negotiation, which those who have negotiated with Microsoft, whatever business they came from, will know well. Fears about loss of access to oxygen were only the result, after all, of what was said about the possible loss of access to oxygen. Air supply became something that a very wealthy and powerful company sometimes claimed they had the right, or at least the power, to cut off. Everybody began to feel a little asphyxiated. Now, I have things to say about why they ought to feel asphyxiated on the basis of the hardware architecture, right? We can talk about how software technically evolved from the world of VMSP on the one hand and X Windows on the other to Windows 2000, largely by the removal of technical features, facilities, and ideas that were important to us circa, say, 1976, and had become less important as the decades went by. We can talk about the ways in which the paradigm of two-dimensional space and you point and grunt in order to express your wishes with respect to your interaction with the machine deprived us of a generation of language design. But that's just my old self speaking. My own wishes about technology and my own hopes, and I'll come back to them in a while when I think about how, for example, Perl or some outrage like that could have happened. What I think we're at the moment in my analysis is simply the reason why a sense of constraint gathered around both the businesses and the users of the world in the course of the 1980s and reached a pinnacle in the later 1990s. Microsoft's effect on the innovation rate in software was devastating. And it took a long time for people to understand just how bad it was. Those who came to understand it in two related ways: as friction over their ability to run their businesses without taxation or control by Microsoft, and as a threat that programming as a discipline would fundamentally become inaccessible to most people because they wouldn't be allowed to modify and share code that worked. So that everybody who wanted to make a thing would have to begin from square one and a purchased toolkit and evolve the way up from zero to hero. Which, of course, was being sold to people as how you make a fortune in the software business. Zero to hero, sell out to Microsoft, everything is cool. How are you going to spend the rest of your life after you retire at 35?
That, by the way, is the origin of Eclipse.
So?
Just to provide an alternative to the A4 SDK.
Well, yeah, and in the end, it's Eclipse, right? All right? I mean, we still haven't exactly figured out how to help people make software. We should come back to that, right? There's lots to do still in how people should make software. But the really interesting thing is, if you let everybody on Earth make software using bad tools, you get a lot of really good software, right? So the thing that happened next was that other edginess about freedom, are there actually going to be ways for people to program based on starting from something that works and making it better? That became the goal of the free software idea. That became the other side of this. As businesses began to assess the potential risk of loss of control within the enterprise arising from a change in the model of software, from a service distinguishing hardware to a product you have to take as given, the agitation in a small but dedicated part of the technical community to Stallman's idea of software freedom was creating an idea about how you might not just make but license software. And here I want to put an awful lot of stress not on GPL3 or GPL2 but GPL1, a license nobody's read and I'm not proposing to quote from. All right, so let's agree that there are three things that could be meant by software as a service, right? There's this mysterious thing called service-oriented architecture, which I diagnose as language without substrate. There's, oh my God, Google, right? That fear that something has happened, right? Applications delivered from some big data center to people who have no control over what comes next, right? And then there's the how to categorize software in a sort of econometric sense. Whether you think of it as a product, an object transferred at a certain moment, or know-how, maintenance, mental activity surrounding a product offered to you by somebody for the purpose of enhancing that other product, either by the manufacturer or somebody working in concert with him, or an independent taking an opportunity to increase the value of fixed assets by the addition of mental labor stored up in some form. Software is a service in that sense, the way math is a service, right?
No, you're missing a big one, really big one, which is that businesses, forget about software for a second, businesses outsource individual tasks for a very particular reason, to retain control over both the cost and what the task is doing.
Yes, and to limit risk.
Because it's a limited risk thing.
Yeah.
That's also a software service to me. Right? You know exactly what service you're getting. You don't have to worry about the stuff because you're asking for a particular piece of.
Right, or could we say managed IT offers that, because that's really not very different from what happens when you make your data center somebody else's property in the same way. So a bundle of hardware and software and engineering services all together become a service that is sold to you at a subscription price, rather than a bunch of property you take and add to your books as fixed assets, subject to whatever the financing agreements are by which you came to have them. I also agree with that, but I don't think that gets particularly to the nature of software. We're watching that happen to IT activity all compact, both inside this company's way of managing IT for customers, and as we watch the Indians developing and setting up entire data centers on spec, waiting to see who comes to them. I think we're going to see more of that in the U.S. economy. I think it's a post-industrial business. I see an awful lot of guys at junior colleges and community colleges around the United States who realize that they could be teaching students how to make and set up data centers and operate them as businesses in parts of the United States that have otherwise small ways to employ people, precisely because it's now a within-reach activity to be a service provider at the data center level. So I agree that that's there. I'm just not sure how to work that in to the analysis I'm trying to offer.
To represent your customers in a different screen to look the way you want, the way you have it before, the contract the way you want it to change. Well, if you contract with a software as a service provider such as Salesforce.com or other, it's free package. This is the solution. Like it or not, take your business around it. I host it for you. I have access to all your customer data and so on, which is similar to outsourced IT. But this is what it is.
But see, here's where, if we were doing this, you're a beautifully hot bench, as the lawyers would say, and so we're taking it out of order. But that one causes me to say, well, let's suppose we jump forward to the point where I point out that Sugar CRM under GPLv3 isn't quite like that anymore. You can buy it in that form, right? And you can acquire it that way if you want it, but you've also got code that you can guarantee that you're going to be able to modify and keep forever, and which you know you're going to be allowed to redistribute if you improve it in a fashion which may allow you to lay off some of your improving it costs, because you know with whom you can share. And you know that your activity therefore allows you to improve your use while increasing your revenue at the other end, because you have a way that you can share. And because everybody's guaranteed that everything they put into it is going to stay available to everybody forever, it actually functions as an alternate. Not an ousting alternate, but a complementary alternate to the form in which you were describing Salesforce.com. That's exactly what's going to happen to CRM. CRM is going to wind up in a world where there are choices. There's closed CRM nobody can touch. There's hosted CRM they would modify for you at a price. And there's Copyleft Capitalist CRM, which is both available, hosted at a price by a whole variety of competing hosting systems, and is modifiable for you, which means you may be able to socialize the cost of modifications you would like to make if you can figure out with whom those modifications could usefully be shared. What happened as a consequence of the free software movement's interest in copyleft was that another scheme was designed for protecting user innovation flows. Right? What the copyleft did from the beginning with that basic promise, whatever you make out of this, you're going to have to keep as free as the parts you started with, was that it created a commons in user innovation. And it turns out that a commons is a good way to treat user innovation. In the same way that it's a good way to treat fisheries or groundwater resources, user innovation is a form of asset, a form of wealth in the system, best operated in the form of commons. And the stronger the commons, the more user innovation goes there, because people are clear about what the split is going to be down the road. The BSD approach to the capturing of user innovation leaves the question, what's the split down the road going to be, completely undefined. The code may go into proprietary hands where it will make a lot of money and nothing will come back. It may go into sharing hands that improve, or it may fork out of all possible control, and there will be a chaos of multiple invention. Experience has shown time after time that BSD projects take all of those paths. The consequence of which is that it's hard for users contemplating significant investments in user innovation to BSD software to know how to manage their risks, because it's not clear what the split is going to be down the road. It's not clear what portion of their investments are ultimately going to be reaped by a proprietary competitor. The consequence of which was that BSD licensing models recaptured very substantial user innovation, but suboptimal levels of user innovation. And it became a competition in model for the capture of user innovation. The decisive force in determining the balance between the BSD license model and the copyleft commons turns out to lie in the question of how businesses retain control over their destiny. Because in the end, and by the end I now mean the late 20th century or the early 21st, it had begun to be clear to businesses concerned with how to maintain their long-term control over their own destiny, given the IT they needed. It began to be clear to them that copyleft innovation gave them certainty about what would happen downstream. You could tell how the split was going to be 5 years from now, because the rules were strong enough to assure that what was in commons was going to stay in commons. The consequence of which was that there was an opportunity for people to say, okay, I know what the fate of this investment is going to be. As firmly, though differently, as though they had patented it themselves. And so the most forward-looking organizations, and IBM is here the poster child, right? The most forward-looking organization in the world about this. Forward-looking organizations say, wait a minute, what I need is more certainty about control over my destiny and a better way to capture user innovation. Naturally, from an IBM point of view, as I have already pointed out, this was in some ways genetically present inside the company's bones. I lived in it, as everybody has in this room who lived in that era. What was happening was that it was possible to go back to an older way of thinking about the relation with customers while achieving a forward-looking coup at how to capture user innovation and get that invested in the business in such a way that you could be sure that it would be long-term stable there. But what about this free software movement? What about this Stallman? What about this fact that this system, which seems to us to contain rational value as customers, as vendors, what about the possibility that this might be under the control of somebody we can't trust? What about the possibility that this in itself might turn out to be a source of risk rather than a limiter of risk? The purpose of GPLv3 as a process, the purpose of the whole 2.5 years that I spent on it, not just the 16 months we spent negotiating it, but the year we spent planning it and talking about it and consulting with people before we rolled up the curtains and began negotiating it. The purpose of that process was to address the primary sociological difficulty of the copyleft commons in this decade, which was making the community feel that they had framed it as well as its outcomes, so that there was an opportunity to talk about the whole as a structure within which business could be done, so that we could ask, how might this help with problems people actually have now, including, of course, patent problems? Now, to be fair about it, all of that license development occurred under the very significant pressure of ideological commitments by the activists for users. Concern, for example, with DRM and trusted computing and other forms of lockdown of software in the end user's hands. Troubled by questions about what happens in the appliance market when the appliances that contain free software can't be modified by end users anymore. An issue which everybody perfectly well understood circa 2005, big business didn't want to talk about and didn't want to get involved in right now, didn't see the need for it. There's no doubt that there continues to be a significant diversity of priority between those whose concern with control over their destiny is concerned with their ability to manage their businesses net of the friction imposed by proprietary software, and the user activists whose immediate concerns are with what they see as sharp and clearly defined issues of technological freedom. But the presence of an enormous overlap between those two agendas, the presence of a vast zone of possible agreement, is where I live and practice law. Between those people whose recognition is that they are programmers trying to make freedom, trying to make sharing possible, trying to achieve certain socioeconomic goals through the sharing of technology, and businesses who recognize that reversing the tendency to the over-ownership or the anti-commons construction of knowledge gives them an opportunity to recoup user innovation, to invest in socialized forms of research and development, and to give themselves more control over their destiny. I am here also saying, and could we please talk about whether this will raise the quality of software? Because I think that's the one part of the whole conversation that we can have, and that only we can have. I go to lots of places where we can talk about the capitalist copyleft and what it will do for small business, or what it will do for IT vendors. And I go to lots of places where I can talk with people about what it will do for programmers' freedom. But I want also to call attention to the hope that it will do something really powerful and important for software, which has languished for reasons that I think the broad-scale sharing of knowledge is designed to address. And here are the two reasons I would adduce for that. First, whatever are the real problems in how to help people make software that we still haven't solved, we can brute force them to a significant extent by creating another billion programmers, right? Whatever are the inflexibilities in the way we invent new means of making life between computers and human beings interesting, we have vast, untapped human resources at our disposal. Closed code made it hard to become a programmer. I know. I was hired by IBM in the summer of 1979, as previously discussed, to do make work. Essentially a project of no importance in which a development shop led by Peter Hertan at Santa Teresa was going to prove that Aidan Falcoff was wrong about something. Not an important something, an unimportant something. But there was going to be a little dust-up between the developers and the researchers, and some summer co-ops were going to be used to make a little evidence for Hertan. And I got hired to do a make-work job. And after I had been doing that make-work job for a couple of days, I went to my immediate babysitter, Dick Dunbar, and I said, you know, there's a feature in the IP-sharp APL interpreter which is really useful and would come in handy for the work that you want me to do. You should put it in the interpreter. And Dick, who was working on something else entirely, namely TSO executors for APL interpreters, said, you do it. And I said, great, but I don't know how to build the thing. He said, oh, that's okay. Larry Breed left a build system around here somewhere. It's on some CMS account or other. I'll find it. And later in the day, he mailed me a stack of punch cards in a virtual sense and said, here's a build system. And so I started looking at the syntax analyzer in the APL interpreter and figuring out how to do this thing. And I admit that I had overpraised my skills as a 370 assembler programmer in order to get the job just a little bit. And the next day I went back in and I said to Dunbar, okay, it's working. And he said, what? And I said, it's working. You asked me to do it. I've done it. It works now. And he came into my office and he looked and he said, oh, my God, right, okay. And somebody came around and said, kid, we need you to get a better job here. But that was possible because it was possible, right? That was possible because I could see the code and I could fool around with it and I could make it work. Now, what happens when you turn that inside out and you have a billion kids around the planet doing that is you get better software. You get it in a very Darwinian way, right? You get an immense amount of variation at random, right? Brownian motion in software. And it comes up through fractional distillation as more and more editors and more repackagers and more people take a look at what's being suggested, and you get a thing like the Linux kernel, which fundamentally works by the fractional distillation of an enormous number of people who would like to get their code in the product. and who are constantly coming up with suggestions that other people can discuss. And it gets piped upward through a self-assembled, partially hierarchical, partially meritocratic, partially bullshit-driven system, which nonetheless, after all, if given enough contributions by people who know where they want to steer the project to, can conquer the world. And what we're going to do to improve software quality in the near term is let that engine run. Big time. With a platform like the one laptop per child, which includes a working model of everything you can hack on.
I tried one 2 weeks ago. It's truly revolutionary. I tried to make those.
See, now, that's what we get because we've had 25 years of really good hardware design, right? And Mary Lou's added some more absolutely wonderful hardware design. All right, so now that stack is the basis upon which you get a whole lot more innovators at work. And we become the editors of innovation instead of the only guys with the keys to the kingdom. I've been trying to estimate what proportion of the Microsoft guys who work on Windows can build Windows. The upper limit is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5%. I can't get to a real number, but I can prove that more than 95% of the people who work on Windows can't build Windows. Right? They're working in a glove box all the time. Unit testing stuff. It's not a surprise that you get real problems, right? It's not a surprise that quality difficulty follows from a world in which people can't build the product. So one aspect to the question, what happened to all the missing innovation, is under copyleft capitalism, it is profitable to let people find out what they can do with your code. You know that it's not going to wind up in somebody else's proprietary product. You know that at a minimum it's going to wind up improving your existing copyleft product, and to the extent that that knowledge enables you to improve your proprietary products on the basis of know-how developed in the free world, it's the free world, and you're allowed, and everybody is encouraged to take and reuse, including to reuse know-how for non-free products. In the end, copyleft capitalism works beautifully for deep-thoughted people who have plenty of opportunity to look at the innovation produced by a vast array of people out there in the world. And IBM was always organized for that. I know it was. I worked in it. Now we come to the other part of this story, which is what happens when you have all those innovators out there, and what they're innovating on is the actual stuff we really use, right? Everywhere I go now to talk at computer science departments, the same thing happens. The faculty skip the talk. In fact, when I was invited for the first time to talk at the Columbia Computer Science Department, which was 17 years after I came to work at Columbia University and after I had done already a fair amount of work in this industry, even the faculty member who invited me to give a lunch talk in the CS department skipped the talk. But I could barely get in the room because of all the graduate students and undergraduates who wanted to talk to me. And wherever I go, whenever I make a presentation, the next step is, oh, we really want to take you back in the skunk works and show you what we're working on. And so I go and I listen to all these fast pitches by graduate students about their projects. And they're wonderful projects. And they're all based on hacking the kernel. And they're all usable tomorrow, right? Because they're based on hacking the kernel. You might not want them. They might not be the patch you want to include in the next set. But what they're doing is working with the stuff that really counts in the world, which means that the distance that you have to go from development to research or back again is very narrow.
We're also done using your filter.
Sure. Absolutely. We have, I'm not going to start a vie against Emacs war. They're done using our stuff, right? They're done in freedom, right? And so the next thing you know, everything you look at, you say, hey, that's a good idea. I'm going to take that and try it for a week and see what I can do with it. And the next thing you know, something really interesting has come out of it, as it always does. So that the consequence of the role that copyleft capitalism puts the IT industry in Yes, bring us more of that rubber out of the rainforest. Yes, grow more renewable resource for us. Yes, give us more innovation all over the ground, is added to in its sweetness by the fact that the innovation arrives not in the form of abstract ideas that might be somehow possible to put in a product. They come already working in the product to which they are most likely to apply. They come, if I may now switch to the use of what I think is the dominant paradigm in our world, they come as proof of concept plus running code. And the power of proof of concept plus running code as an infrastructure for innovation is unmatched. Because when there's running code, people will hack on it. Right? Because it produces the incentive to continue to work on it. Because it redoubles the economic incentives with the actual great human need to fiddle with something that is working to see if you can make it do tricks. And the consequence of that is an outpouring at the micro level of precisely the kind of creativity which it is otherwise expensive and difficult and unstable to train and maintain. And every great research institution has coped since its foundation with the question, how do you maintain that sweet spot where everybody comes to work whistling all the time with the neat stuff they might be able to do today? And what the free world accomplished was to create a mechanism for redoubling that feeling and spreading it geographically as thin as you please. Right? By offering people a way to engage in that feeling with one Finnish person and two Australians and a Turk and a South African who will never meet in the same room, ever. Engaged in using the commodity internet to integrate their product and give themselves an infrastructure for experiencing that kind of creativity. Samba, may I offer as an example, right? A project of a bright guy, right? Tridgell is busy working on his doctoral dissertation, except not quite so much. So how about if he has a little nights and weekends government work project when not busy on RSync to figure out a way to do printer and file sharing on a Windows network using a Linux computer?
By the way, it's the reason it's a penguin, because Andrew tried to hire Linus in 1992 to come here from Australia. And during that visit, the penguin came out as the mascot.
So here you have a guy doing a thing which is in the beginning one man's project and then 8 people's project and then a team, and which is now, though the European Commission didn't exactly give us what they should have given us, had given their recognition, which is now the competitor, right? The reason there's going to be competition to interoperate in server operating systems, at least as the European Commission sees it. In other words, copyleft capitalism paying off big. My role is to represent people like that at the beginning and all the way along. I started representing the Samba team in 1995. The question, how do you figure out who's going to be that important in the future, is a question to which I have no answer any more than anybody else. Getting in on the ground floor is a matter of shoe leather and looking and talking to everybody and trying to understand. I don't think it's impossible to do. That is to say, I think it is possible to be a wise investor in free software projects. But I think the really important part of what the GPL and related legal and social structures allows us is the development of a robust market in that kind of intervention, in which backing your own choices and backing other people's choices and building derivatives of the choices you have backed is a legitimate and effective strategy for businesses trying to make money. It is certainly the case that it is an ecological strategy for businesses trying to make money. Because you discover after a fairly short period of time, let us say half a decade or so, as IBM discovered by the middle of this decade, that you now have very substantial profit flows that arise out of non-profit supply chain. You have what is, in most capitalist situations, an unusual event that occurs, in which non-profit production enables substantial downstream profits. The usual effect of that, of course, is to stimulate the purchase of the nonprofit, and it's becoming a profit center. If General Motors discovered that $400 of profit in every vehicle coming off the line were attributable to some nonprofit in downtown Detroit, they'd go and buy the nonprofit and turn it into a profit center and integrate. Copyleft prevents the vertical integration. So you wind up with a durable situation in which you're going to have a long-term nonprofit infrastructure which significantly contributes to profit streams that you want to maintain and grow. What do? You model a nonprofit producer as a renewable natural resource. And your question goes from how do I possess the thing to how do I conserve the thing. You begin to see it as though it were forestry or a fishery. You begin to act as though the important thing about the commons is that it be there tomorrow. Nobody should be allowed to burn it down. When your neighbor down the street begins to collect, Agent Orange in the patent system and threatens to devegetate the entire forest, you say, wait a minute, we're not in favor of that anymore. We have to do something to prevent that kind of use of the patent monopoly to attack the renewable resources where our profits come from. And you can feel in the agonizing reappraisal over the software patent system the taking hold of precisely that logic. Wait a minute, of course it's true that my shareholders' property is something I'm not going to give away lightly. And I'm not going to give away my opportunity to turn my existing assets into further assets by the manufacturing of statutory monopolies in the patent office. At the same time, I have to prevent the misuse of those monopolies from other people from attacking and destroying the commons from which I am increasingly getting resources that I need in order to make a profit. How do I balance those questions? And suddenly the role of the IP managers becomes to think about how to balance between profitable increases in the shareholders' assets within the firm and the prevention of ecological damage downstream by an excess of anti-commons rights in the hands of other parties. And so you begin to look for intermediaries who can help you control those downstream risks. Now, having said that much, I want to take both one more technical and one more legal piece out of the recent evolution of the license, and then I'll be done and we'll just take questions. I want to point to the way in which GPL3 was not merely an attempt to improve these aspects of the copyleft commons for business, but an attempt to bring about an agreement among businesses on the relation between this and the patent situation. The goal of GPL3 from the beginning was to address elements that had gone unaddressed in the license in 1991 in version 2 because the software patent situation was so much less well developed or so much better in 1991 than it is now. The primary goal of the GPL3 process was to figure out a way to encourage parties who are within the commons in the license not to betray one another through aggressive uses of patent rights. Our goal when we began fashioning GPL3 was not to deal with external threats using patents. We believed that that was largely outside the domain of what a copyright license for shared software could achieve. And to the extent that the Novell Microsoft deal made us do some of that work, it was jury-rigged engineering at best. The real goal of the license's patent provisions from the beginning was to assure that parties within the commons behaved with their patents in ways that make the commons durable rather than fragile. And this is going to have, I believe, very significant effects for good. The parties who participated in the GPL3 negotiations include many parties, IBM, Nokia, Hewlett-Packard, Apple, who have discrepant patent policies and who usually find it very difficult to agree in standards organizations or elsewhere on fundamental matters of patent policy because their business models with respect to their patent assets significantly diverge. The ability to get an agreement on how the patent rules should work inside the GPL commons from all of those parties such that everybody in the end agreed, whether they liked it or they disliked it, that it was usable, that it did not represent a red line in their own internal patent thinking or a break point for them with respect to the license, was a powerful achievement, I think, in negotiation. And like all such achievements, it belongs to the whole community that made it. We have at least learned that it is possible to reach such anti-betrayal agreements concerning patents in a way that accommodates the patent employment and deployment policies of the world's major IT vendors. That's an important lesson learned. The second thing I would say about it is that those anti-defection rules, those, if you pass works downstream, you have to give reasonable security against any deployment of your patents against those works or their derivatives downstream, is going to have some unexpected consequences when GPL is used as the license that applies to hardware designs. We are already seeing experiment with the use of GPL as a license for hardware design by Sun Microsystems, and we're going to see more of it. And when that hardware design licensing begins to occur under GPL3 rather than GPL2, it will carry a patent pool along with it because of the way the license works. So everybody will be guaranteed that all the upstream parties who have contributed to a hardware design are going to withhold their patent enforcement powers with respect to downstream derivatives of that hardware design. People will be able to improve the design and use it in products without concern that the upstream patent holders who contributed to that design will be able to betray them and seek a piece of the business. This is going to have interesting and valuable consequences. Again, obviously, I say hardware innovation is not the innovation I think we mostly need to accelerate. It has been doing very well, thank you. But what copyleft capitalism can do is not limited to software. And I think we're going to see interesting and valuable demonstrations of that in the next couple of years. Yes, Dave.
There's a third thing, which I know you're aware of, but most people aren't. I learned it from Randy Metcalf of a group called OSS Watch in the UK, and that's that a number of organizations around the world had adopted GPLv3, even knowing much of language is based on U.S. law and didn't apply outside the U.S. And one of the advantages I know you were for GPLv3 was to use language that would really look around the globe and not just in this current context.
Yeah, I didn't want to talk here about things which are matters of technology for lawyers rather than technology for technologists. It is true that there are some matters of legal technology about GPL that needed to be fixed, and you're exactly right. In my judgment, the rather parochial Americanness of GPL version 2 was a significant drawback. It opened a weakness in what would happen in the courts around the world in the next 10 years or so, and I am glad that we have provided a license which offers another way of doing that work. In the process, if you want to pursue that just a little further, what we actually did was to create a method of transnational drafting. The real question isn't just how do you make one copyright license which works the way it should work in all the world's major legal systems. It's can you generalize from that how to draft in such a way as to do that more routinely. I know that the Creative Commons license stock will gain a structural reorganization this coming year because Creative Commons is moving from every license remade in every jurisdiction through legal translation structure to a structure in which the rootstock licenses, the SA and the SANC, are written like GPL3 in a transnational form. That means that there's much less work to do to tailor each one to an existing country environment. I think there is a technological benefit to GPL3 in the context of transnational drafting, but transnational drafting isn't going to make people in this room terribly interested. Here I can talk about such fascinating topics as the Perl interpreter. Which I do want to talk about. That is to say, I want to talk about what happens when the need for innovation is dammed up for a long period of time and you've just got to do something, which, in my judgment, is pretty much how you get the Perl interpreter, right? You have to have something that works, right? Language is threatening to come to a halt. The way that the world has designed programming will work in a world of server-client implementations, all of them based around platform management in a certain corporate style. But we're not doing that. We're doing the web, right? We don't have language that reflects even the kinds of values like laziness that are really important in making the web. As an APL designer, I feel deeply ambivalent about Perl. It's sort of an example of everything that should never be allowed to happen in language design. And on the other hand, I can't but love the beauty of the let's just make it and let's just do it in whatever way first comes to mind, and let's leave it to the interpreter to figure out how to really do what we just wrote. And by God, it all sort of works, and next thing you know, every web server in the world is running on it, right? Which doesn't for an instant stop the theoretical language designers of the world from recognizing that it's a grotty language and wanting to Pythonize it, right? Which is great, which makes, after all, some, theoretical computer sciencey kind of sense, right? That's why I went to the Pascal compiler project. Let's have strong typing and, let's really do this right for a change. And Perl sort of stands there refusing to do anything right, making everything an artifact of some new syntactic cleverness that we thought up in the middle of last night for a new way to use the asterisk to add, object orientation or something. And you think to yourself, this is plainly a language for 1 billion people to hack in. Good, bad, and ugly, it's a demonstration that in the end you can't constrain people's desire to do that. I think that this in the end is the real point about copyleft capitalism. Copyleft capitalism is the 21st century apotheosis of Yankee ingenuity. It's the outgrowth of the kind of democratization of technology characteristic of the United States in the first half of the 19th century, when this was a society growing in an explosive way. Thomas Jefferson thought that it would take 100 years for the society that made the Constitution to reach and overleap the Mississippi River and enter into the Trans-Mississippi West, and it had happened before he died. The explosion of the economy of the United States at the beginning of the 19th century was treated by the great legal and economic historian Willard Hearst as the prime example of what Hearst called the release of energy principle, which was a way of saying that libertarianism and the just do it and get it done and make it work and we'll worry about it afterwards is the bone in the American body, and that it was the source of the economic explosion which allowed all the riches of the continent to be exploited to their fullest in a short period of time by a society that immigrated all the skilled labor that it had. Now, this is a perfectly reasonable analysis of what happened when there was an empty continent that needed filling. And what I'm talking about is a burst of innovation in the 21st century that comes not from the sudden population of an empty continent full of wealthy natural resources, but the result of the net's arrival in the most of human life, in all those places in the world where brains have previously gone untapped and where they are now about to come online in the biggest way. This is what ought to be the great source of innovation in 21st century human life. It's probably enough innovation even to cope with the extraordinary social difficulties that the 20th century has bequeathed to the 21st. We're about to have a world in which every single Einstein learns physics, which has never happened before in the history of human beings. And what happens then is a really good subject to pursue. But what I'm suggesting is that one of the primary ways in which we make that happen, in which we make that reality occur, is through the pursuit of the commons in software. The commons in software pays a multiple in its effects because not only does it provide access to knowledge, but it makes the technology which provides further access to knowledge. It's not merely that people learn how to program. It's that as we improve the technology, the net becomes a more robust way of doing all the other things that we need to do in order to tap all the brains that are here. The fundamental responsiveness of the copyleft idea to the real political economy of our time is what makes it far more than any idea about proprietary innovation or the virtues of the patent system or look at how good Windows could be if we only modularized it. That's all surface stuff. The underlying reality about why innovation is about to break loose in a storm is the ability to share information about the technology that makes information sharing possible, which enables a kind of exponential growth in what people know and how they know it and what they share and how they share it. And it's out of that that the canniest and most highly organized technology firms in the world are going to make their running, because that's a fat, rich, new, unexplored land on which they're going to set up their businesses and go. And all of us who make 1 or 2 or 3, or as it now seems to me, 4 trips a year to India, know exactly what that's about. That's about what happens when all those engineers arrive. And all that thinking and all that creating is suddenly available to the world's businesses, not trapped inside service provision structures. Can you give us a workaround for this well-known problem that nobody has fixed since the beginning of Windows XP, but can you think of a new way of doing this which is better, faster, cheaper, and revolutionarily advantageous? And, you know, somebody thought up a great new sorting algorithm last year. How long has it been since that happened? Somebody actually added something to Knuth on sorting? Right? Yes, really, right? And we've all sort of assumed that that there was no more fundamental game coming, right? That we had exhausted those moments of real discovery. But we haven't exhausted them. We just exhausted people's ability to get in the game by raising the bar so high. Nobody had a source license. Nobody had anything to work with. If it weren't for the fact that the industrial quality stuff is now accessible to everybody, that innovation would have gone unplumbed. So that's my case. My case is software should have been better all this time. What prevented software from getting better was our inability to share it with all the people who would have improved it. The way to share it with all the people who will have improved it is to be sure that it's not going to come back to haunt you. The Commons, Copyleft Commons, gave business enterprise a way of understanding with certainty what would happen to its user innovation investments downstream, thus encouraging those investments, thus making it possible for us to cycle the structure of innovation so that a large number, I mean a really large number, of new innovators could enter the market, knowing that commercial use will be made of their inventions and desiring nothing more than to see that occur without getting a piece of the output for themselves, thus enabling an extraordinary advantage to commercial organizations which can make use of the Copyleft Commons and spelling doom, that's D-O-O-M, for those that can't. And that, I think, is really what this is all about. That's what I'm standing here after 25 years to say. I'm coming back relatively humbly to report a problem solved. Right? How to get innovation fundamentally upped by a couple of orders of magnitude in the software business. I can see the young man that I was not having the vaguest idea how to get that done. I can see everything that's happened since as a random tour around Westchester and Lower Manhattan. But at least today I have found my way back, and I can tell you, done that. Thank you very much. So.
25 years is indeed the right number. 25
Well, this
years
is
ago,
Michelle Hack, actually.
25 years ago, we had this culture within, in a smaller scale, within IBM, where the source code to all IBM products was available to anybody, where we could play with it, try new things, and there were at least 3 different centers for this happening. There was here at Georgetown, there was in San Jose, and there was in Kingston.
I said before you arrived, Michelle, that 26 years ago I was hacking on Pry as an APL developer, trying to make it work better for the things I needed to have done. That's right. Right. I mean, that was my point. It was baked in the genetics of the institution. The reason it was easy to come back to for IBM was we had collectively been there. And the way we got off that road and how we wandered back onto it is, in some sense, for me, the precondition of what this means. And here you and I are again, right? I mean, that's what happened. That's the lesson of a quarter century.
So, let's see, Microsoft is a very focused company with a lot of money.
Yep.
A lot of people that, believe that the Microsoft model is not the right way to go. On the other hand, they don't necessarily have common interest among all these millions of people that have different goals in mind. It seems sort of challenge to bring together enough critical mass among all these people with different interests. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I work at the intersection of the market and the movement, and I'm here to tell you that may not be harder than getting an agreement between FSF and Apache and Debian about something. It's not just the quarrelsomeness of businesses with different needs or different reporting periods, but there are defects on both sides. The characteristic complaint, and it's a justified one, about the American publicly financed corporation is that it has an enormous tendency to think short, because results at 6 months are the ones the market cares about, and the quarter is the only manipulable entity. The hackers, on the other hand, have a remarkable tendency to think overlong, right? From Stallman's point of view, anything less than a 100-year time scale is just an invitation to think like a business. The real question is, what's the permanent fate of freedom? Now, as a person who has occasionally criticized in writing American late 20th century finance capitalism for thinking short, I'm delighted to have clients who think in 50-year and 100-year timescales, but of course, it's not really possible, right? They don't actually know what's going to happen 50 years out, and it's not a very good conversation to try and organize between people whose fixed point is so distant that it amounts to a philosophic commitment, and those who are managing quarter to quarter with an eye on the market and the bottom line. Both are characteristic difficulties in trying to build political coalitions, but they're not insuperable. And the reason that they're not insuperable is that there's proof of concept in running code. There's actual bread and actual butter, and people can see which side their butter's on these days. From 1999 on, the relations between my clients and IBM have only gotten closer. Of course, there are difficulties, and there are doubts, and there's this problem, and there's that problem. But the clear identities of interest have been seen. The agreements to disagree have largely been filed and understood. People know what's what and who's who, and there's a real opportunity to deal on an open basis with predictable partners. People said, Stallman doesn't bother us. We know what he thinks. He's a consistent thinker. We know that what he thinks today is what he's going to think tomorrow. And if we don't know what he thinks about a certain subject, we can certainly make a damn good guess. And the same is true with respect to commercial parties who have integrity in their businesses. You look and see what do they need, and you know how they will behave. I think that the problem presented by Microsoft is not primarily they have the inside lines, we have the outside lines of communication, and we're at a disadvantage. The problem presented by Microsoft is the problem presented by all failing empires. What will we do when they suddenly tumble and there are a lot of people in danger of being crushed in the wreckage? Our real problem now is how to get safely out of the Microsoft era, because they do not intend to help us get safely out of the Microsoft era. But out, we must now come. Microsoft has now failed the first duty of a software monopolist. If you want to be a software monopolist, your first overwhelming duty is to get your old product out of the market when you release a new one. Otherwise, you begin competing with yourself, and for a monopolist, that's destructive. Microsoft has until this point always succeeded, even when a bad product like Windows ME arrived. Microsoft managed to prevent internal competition between products from growing great enough to threaten it. That's not true anymore. Every week now, I speak to CIOs of large organizations who will never, quote, never, meaning never, use Vista. That means that the monopolist has failed. He is going to be engaged in internal competition with himself for the duration. And that at a time when the limits on the software engineering conducted the way he conducts it are becoming visible to everybody. It is hard to get more quality out of that system because that system has limits to where its innovation can come from. That's the difficulty. Now we have to figure out how to get out from under that without the collapsing colossus hitting lots of people on the head, ruining my clients, harming the system, paroxysms of litigation, commercial difficulties, bad play and final period of play difficulties of a game theoretic kind. There are a whole series of issues. But I don't think the issue is we won't be able to pull our coalition tight enough. I think that's not the difficulty.
So the case that you made, if I could think about this in a very naive manner, can I characterize that as if we build it, they will come?
Well, that's how it looked. That's how it looked 10 years ago. Could I now say we have built it and they're arriving? Would that be okay?
Is it okay to say that? We know there is a problem with that phrase because it doesn't always work.
Yeah, so that's why I try not to take credit for things until they started happening already, and there are some measurable results. In my judgment, it would be wrong to say if we build it, they will come. It would be right to say we built it and they're here, right? Look, the thing that SCO noticed and made such a fuss about is that between 2.4 and 2.6, something happened to the Linux kernel, right? We built it and carried it through 2.4 as the community's kernel. And then something happened, and the big troops arrived. And it became possible to optimize that kernel for performance in environments that you couldn't get to from where we sat, right? You know, problems of the data center that guys working at home in their bedrooms didn't have, we started solving. I'm astounded, myself, I'm astounded at what happens as multi-core chips begin to arrive inside little personal gear. And all of a sudden, a guy who throws away a laptop with a single-core processor in it and swaps in a new laptop with a dual-core processor in it, and his operating system doesn't even take a blink. It just suddenly races for the stars, because it's making absolutely perfect use of that second core from the beginning without any reprogramming of anything. It's just there waiting to happen. That's a sign of how we built it and they came, right? And things qualitatively changed because of that. And SCO, hoping to cash in on that qualitative change, brought a lawsuit against the wrong party, and the rest is history so far as that goes. But it's a recognition of the moment when we arrived, as is the patent threatening from Microsoft now. Nothing short of external, non-technological forces is going to derail this movement now. That's the point. And the movement now consists not of a socioeconomic class of programmers trying to get its point across. The movement now consists of businesses trying to make a marketplace that they see as better for themselves and better for their customers, which means the whole weight of capitalism is behind the move.
The LTC estimates that over half the core kernel developers are paid by corporations to work on it, and they account for over 2/3 of all accepted patches.
Yeah, and that's the kernel. Then the tool chain comes to look more like that too, right? Everybody, including SCO, right through the lawsuit, SCO kept sending in GCC patches to the Free Software Foundation with copyright assignments attached, right? because they needed to keep the compiler working on their system, right? The sense that we are in a common boat and you can't kick the bottom out, right, is also the reason that you pay the developers, right? We are in an ecological relationship to one another now, and we've got to do what it takes to keep our shared, spaceship Earth afloat here. And that's the moment at which qualitatively things change, because the level of investment in the commons begins to approach the level of investment in what we each have in our own private fortunes. And as that happens, the commons becomes an enduring part of the environment. It can't be removed. Right? I wrote an essay in '99 in which I said governments will start using free software for the protection of the public fisc. Once they start using free software for the protection of the public fisc, freedom becomes legally unchallengeable, because when the Attorney General stands in a courtroom and says, Your Honor, we just want you to know that this is what runs the trains, the post office, and the army, the courts are not going to give rulings that say, well, you can't do it around here. It was predictable that that also meant that the largest software market in the world, governments, were going to shift, and Microsoft is now fighting hard in every way, including dirty, to prevent that shift from occurring at its natural pace. But it can't be stopped. What government is in the end going to say, no, we demand the right to spend more in order to get less, using the people's money for worse purposes? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. No, because you can't get enough in kickbacks to make it work, right? You can do it with concrete on the interstate, but you can't really do it with software. The numbers are too big. We're not going to, even in the places I go where corruption is a serious issue, it's not a serious enough issue to make that easy. It's hard to sell the whole country to Microsoft all at once and take 10%. Some places it has been attempted, but it's really, really difficult. And there's always now some countervailing force. The vendors, the young people, the free community. It gets difficult to do. 5 years from now, it'll be impossible. All right, I've kept everybody a very long time. I thank you very, very much. It's been wonderful.